Windows Phone, a product with so much potential that had everything going for it, and yet, one that failed spectacularly. Despite the billions of dollars and the priceless connections of Microsoft, the Windows Phone never took off and would go down in history as one of Microsoft's most expensive mistakes. In this video, we're gonna look at the reasons behind its failure and the actions Microsoft could have taken to possibly prevent it. When Steve Jobs announced the iPhone in 2007, he took the smartphone world by storm. Up until then, smartphones had a big problem. They had small screens with interfaces that were hard to navigate, and the reason for that was because half of the phone was occupied by a keyboard with tiny buttons you could hardly press with any precision at all. What Steve Jobs showed to his ecstatic audience was a game changer, but it wasn't just Apple fans there were watching. The engineers at Google, which for the past 2 years had been building a smartphone of their own, had to scrap their entire project and to start over with a touchscreen design. Their final product, Android, would arrive more than a year later, at which point the iPhone had taken the smartphone crown. The iPhone's model was built on exclusivity. It was entirely produced by Apple to establish maximal control over the user experience and the quality of the product, which allowed Apple to charge a premium for their phones. To succeed, Android would have to adopt a different strategy. Instead of going for exclusivity, Google tried to be everyone's friend, partnering up with as many phone manufacturers as possible, with the selling point of their phones being the fact that they were cheap, yet functional. For a time, the smartphone world was in balance, with Android and the iPhone occupying very distinct segments of the market. And yet, this balance would soon be disturbed by another tech giant, Microsoft. Now, out of the three companies, it was actually Microsoft that, and yet, Microsoft ran into a big problem very early on. You see, Microsoft was trying to do something very difficult. It was emulating Apple in trying to establish strict control over the user experience and hardware, but unlike Apple, it wasn't actually making its own phones. This approach made the Windows Phone a very refined product, but the degree of control Microsoft wanted made working with smartphone design isn't really widely recognized, but it should be. At a time when the iPhone and Android were stuck with static icons, the Windows Phone gave you tiles with live information. Overall, critics had much to praise. In terms of design, the Windows Phone user experience was right up there next to Apple, and because Microsoft had very strict requirements for the hardware used by phone man, sense of confidence they never recovered from. Now, as they say, it's better late than never, and when Microsoft finally got around to it, their development was actually pretty fast. Microsoft began developing a touchscreen-based mobile device in late 2008, and it took them only 2 years to get it ready for market. What Steve Ballmer unveiled was indeed a very unique product whose advancement of by Nokia. But this success is exactly what blinded Microsoft to threat of the iPhone. And just in case you were thinking he's an exception, the CEOs of BlackBerry and Palm were equally skeptical of the new iPhone. It took Microsoft a full year of declining market share to finally realize that something had to be done. Unlike Microsoft, BlackBerry's sales were still increasing, which gave them the operating system it ran was known as Windows CE, which was basically Windows 3 modified to function on the lowest specifications possible. Over the next decade, Microsoft would add features and develop this product line extensively, making another 6 full releases. Between 2006 and 2008, Microsoft's mobile devices claimed a 15% market share, greater than any of their competitors except Symbian. I've asked Tom McGill from the Windows CE group to join me on stage and give us a quick glimpse of some of the neat things that are built into the handheld PC. For those of you that might not have seen one yet, Bill talked a little bit about the handheld PC, and this happens to be the Casio unit actually. By 2013, the stock price of Nokia had fallen by 75%, at which point angry shareholders were threatening to just fire Stephen Elop and get rid of Microsoft altogether. In the end, that didn't happen. Microsoft instead just purchased Nokia's mobile phone division for $7.2 billion in 2014. Production issue: 4 years after the introduction of the iPhone, it had fallen to a 2% market share. Nobody was developing applications for the Windows Phone, and why would they, considering that Android and iOS were clearly the winners here. For its first 3 years, the Windows Phone App Store was empty. It didn't have Instagram. It didn't have YouTube. It barely had anything. Other phone manufacturers knew that this was happening, which pushed them even farther away from Microsoft. After all, why would they fund their own development and pay a licensing fee to Microsoft, when Nokia was getting it all for free? Effectively, Microsoft had gone all in with Nokia and there was no going back. But sadly for Microsoft, it was far too late. By the time Microsoft solved its selling their first Windows Phone in November 2011, and I can tell you right away that this was possible thanks to the billions of dollars Microsoft poured into Nokia's platform support payments. Nokia was supposedly paying Microsoft a licensing fee, but in reality it was actually getting $250 million back from Microsoft every quarter, which more than made up for their expenses. Of course, the Stephen Elop was a former Microsoft executive, and the first item on his agenda was to try to restore Nokia's declining market share by abandoning Symbian and pivoting towards Windows Phone. Now, you can tell that this was a very premeditated plan, because this massive transition, during which Nokia completely changed their product offerings, happened in the span of a single year. Nokia made working with them much more difficult for phone manufacturers compared to working with Android. Unsurprisingly, most phone manufacturers decided to partner up with Google, which left Microsoft in a very bad position. It had a great product and no one to make it. The only saving grace for Microsoft was a lucky connection, when Nokia replaced their CEO in September 2010, the new guy, tightened for decades. There's a lesson to be learned here about the importance of compromising in business, but there's one sphere in life where you shouldn't compromise, and that is keeping all your passwords secure. Thanks for watching. We share with you science, tech, history, and much more. Kindly sub. It's easy to imagine the different path Windows Phone could have taken had it only not been as greedy with its original philosophy. Had Microsoft been willing to compromise on its control over production, it would have easily convinced the big manufacturers to use Windows Phone instead of Android. After all, back then Google had practically no ecosystem to speak of, while Microsoft had been a software